Okay, welcome back to Tasting Tuesday after a little bit of a hiatus. We are back, ready to make your life a little bit tastier. And today we are talking about the next sip in the progression of the critical tasting we've been going through. And that sip is what I call the body sip. So our last sip was assessing the difference in the taste and the aroma of the beer that combine to make flavor. And our second sip, we're going to start looking into mouthfeel elements, and we're going to look at body, carbonation, and then I'll give you a little note on creaminess at the end. Thought it would be appropriate to crack a milk stout, a nitro milk stout, because it's all about the mouthfeel. So the first thing you're going to notice, I don't know if we can see any of that nitro action. The first thing you're going to notice when taking a sip of beer as far as mouthfeel is usually the carbonation, because those bubbles are just going to jump right on your tongue and start dancing around, or not, depending on the level of carbonation. And that's where you're going to get the most feel when you say mouthfeel. That's like the most touch sensation you're going to have. And there's a couple things that go into how those bubbles are actually going to feel on your tongue. Carbonation is always made up of bubbles, but they can be finer, what I call like a champagne, a fine bubble, or big, rough soda pop bubbles. Another thing that affects how that carbonation is going to feel is the gas it's made up of. So, like I said, this is nitro, and the whole point of carbonating a beer with nitro is to have that really tight, fine, tiny bubbles that create like almost a creaminess on top. Instead of like having a real head, you just get this layer of really tight bubbles that you can't even really see the individual bubbles. And that's because of how gas escapes the liquid. CO2, on the other hand, is what's giving you those things that we're familiar with in America, that like Coca-Cola bubble, that really almost where you can feel the carbonation coming out of your nose because CO2 is leaving solution in your mouth so quickly. To get a good idea of the spectrum, I always tell people to try San Pellegrino, super fine, really subtle bubbles next to LaCroix, which is that big, rough, soda pop, huge bubble on your tongue sensation. So those two are kind of the spectrum. Is it a really small, gentle, light bubble, or is it a really big, intense bubble? So that's one part of carbonation. And then there's also the quantity of bubbles. Does the carbonation die out in a second? You know, it's in my mouth and I felt a couple bubbles and now it's gone. Or can you hold it in your mouth for a while and still feel that prickling and it's dying slowly? And like a Duvel you take into your mouth, tons of bubbles, like tons of CO2, you can feel it in your mouth. Or something maybe like an oatmeal stout where there is carbonation. It's that CO2 carbonation, but it's just not as much going on. It only takes a second or two to go flat in your mouth. So that's why it's like as soon as you take the sip on the body sip, you need to think immediately, like, what's the carbonation doing? So as soon as you go, and so this is soft. I mean, it's barely there. You know, it's a little bit finer, and also those bubbles were gone within half a second of it being in my mouth. It was already flat. So that's another thing we're going to do in the body sip is let it go flat in your mouth and see how long did that take, how many bubbles were there in the first place. And this is when we get into body, which is another aspect of mouthfeel in beer. So carbonation is actually separate from body, but it can be hard to separate them if you're rushing. You took a second, you had the carbonation, you're going to hold that beer in your mouth, let it go flat, and then give it a swish and just think, okay, what's left? What's the body? So that's the body sip. We're going to go quick. Now I'm thinking about the body of the beer. And so just like I displayed the spectrum of carbonation with those two sparkling waters, this will get into something a little different. I think a really good way to think about body is with milk. Because basically you can think about just using the same ingredients and all that's really changing is body. So we'll start with something like a non-fat milk. And you can think of this like maybe a Pilsner. You know, it has that really thin body, but all that carbonation gives it a little mouthfeel. But this, it's right there on the watery side of the spectrum. We have our whole milk. And so, yeah, when you're thinking of body, you're thinking of texture descriptors. You know, is it watery? Is it syrupy? Is it thick? Is it chewy? There's your milk. You can see how it's coating the glass, whereas the lighter body just ran back down. And then here's like your big, chewy, oat-filled barley wine with lactose or something like that. Just really heavy, syrupy, low carbonation, probably with something that thick. And so when you think about this, it's like these beers would be made with the exact same ingredients. Doesn't matter about the carbonation. This is that body that's left over. And obviously here we're talking about 3 different ranges of fat, but in beer we're talking about dextrins or proteins. And for the technical breakdown of what actually gives a beer a body, you can read the whole blog post. But just think of this as it's your beer with the same 2 ingredients. You let the carbonation go flat in your mouth. Which body is it more like? I'm not going to do it now, but sip your way through some milks and think, am I leaning more towards cream? Am I right in the middle? Or is it kind of watery and just running all over the place? We talked about the size of the carbonation. It's nice and fine, but it's definitely got some chew there. It's not totally watery even after it's flat. A little bit creamy, more like whole milk, I would say probably. But speaking of creamy, I have seen certain places where they break out creamy as its own aspect of mouthfeel. When it gets into tasting like this, I just don't think that's very helpful. Creamy can come together from those small bubbles and the medium body, and all of a sudden it's creamy. Or it can taste creamy to you because it tastes like vanilla and it's very low carbonation, and you're like, oh, that reminds me of cream. So I think creaminess is best left as a descriptor instead of saying, is it low creamy or high creamy? Of course, if something tastes creamy, like I feel like this has a little bit of a creamy factor to it. Certainly use that as your descriptor, but I don't think you should break it out as another aspect of mouthfeel unless you're taking a very specific test where creaminess is on the syllabus as part of mouthfeel. Our first sip, we just sipped to be like, does the taste match the aroma? Which it should. This sip, as soon as it hits your mouth, you're saying, what am I feeling about carbonation? How big are the bubbles? How many are there? And then your second, you're going to let it go flat, 2-3 seconds in your mouth, give it a swish. Think of your milk spectrum. Is it a heavy body? Is it a light body? Is it watery? Is it syrupy? Is it chewy? Is it silky? All of our beautiful descriptions. And then we'll move on to our third sip, which is our final sip in our many-step process, and that is the aftertaste sip, or after feel sip, if you will. So we'll get into that more next week. Cheers.